giving a webinar. It's, don't worry, I can do it with my left hand over there. How many of you are currently going through a reorganization at your organization? Okay, how many of you have had no reorganization in the last 2 years? Okay, and you wonder why they let you attend today. Okay, this is the perfect moment to reorg. Because what's really interesting is that for many of us, the process of reorganization has become a continuous one, not an exception. I literally am working with a couple of organizations that have stopped publishing org charts. Because in their view, the organization is now fluid, you know, and that once they publish it, it's kind of out of date. And instead, it's going to be on a plasma screen when you arrive in the morning. So you can sort of see where you've moved to and the like. Now, let's take a look at some stuff. There are a couple of words that you're going to hear me talk a lot about, and I think they're intriguing words, and none of them are new words. I'm not one who likes to add to the vocabulary. I think, if anything, many of us in the world of change have made the mistake of inventing words, inventing terms, and then putting little trademarks next to those terms, and pretending that what we're talking about is brand new, when in fact it's kind of old. How many of you have ever been in a presentation where somebody's showing you this really cool new theory of management and life, and it's this 4-box grid, you know? And you're sitting there, and you go, I've seen this before, you know? It was the same grid, but it was called Management by Wandering Around a few years ago. And before that, it was called Total Quality Living. And before that, it was called Get the Troops Rolling and the like. And one of the interesting things is our workforce, particularly those that have been around 10, 15, 20 years, become cynical because they often see us with this big drum roll talk about how everything is brand new. And then we go on to explain something that's remarkably familiar and old in that process. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want to use some very familiar terms with us. I would argue that we are at an intriguing moment in history where organizations are going to need to be enormously agile, and where agility is going to become a critical factor for our employees, for their families, and for organization effectiveness in general. Let me give you an example. A colleague of mine called up about 3 weeks ago and said, Elliott, I need help recruiting somebody. And I'm not a headhunter, I don't do that. But every now and then people call me up just so they can tap into my network. And they said, I want to hire a community gardener. I go, why are you calling me? I said, I grew up in New York City. I don't know a lot about landscaping. No, you don't get it. I don't want them to garden flowers. I want them to be the gardener on our internal social networks and blogs. I want them to weed the crap out when it's there. I want them to seed that. Can you find me a gardener? Now, it's an intriguing role. How many of you here have your master's in community gardening here, okay? It wasn't there when I went to college. We weren't thinking about that. The function didn't exist. And suddenly, they are creating a function. Now, what's really interesting, they hired that person, and 3 days later, they hired 3 more. They now have a squad of gardeners. Now, why have they hired a squad of gardeners? Well, they're a retail organization, and they've noticed that every day around the world, their company is named in between 200 and 500,000 different places. And they didn't have anybody who was reading it. And they didn't have anybody who would even carry on that conversation. So suddenly, they went out and they hired the gardener. Now, they went to their HR department, and my background is HR, yours is, so we're all among friends. The door is closed here. And while they're videotaping, they may put a blue blob over some of the stuff that we talk about. They went to their dear HR department, okay, and they said, well, give me the specs for this job. And he said, I don't really know. I just know we got to find somebody who's going to track the crap. Well, you can't have a job description that says tracking the crap, you know. So they wrote this very explicit, like 14 element, and nobody who was interested would ever want to go for that job spec. So they got it and they said, no. And they did not want to call it a community gardener. They wanted to call it a content librarian and metadata supervisor. They would not get that. They were really explicit. People were writing weird things on internal and external blogs that were impacting their brand. They wanted to figure out how to change that. And the interesting part is the person who came up with the community gardener was the daughter of the director of HR. She wrote the job description for that. Now, when she brought it in and her daughter wrote that and she circulated, she said, wow, this is really good. Maybe we should outsource all job descriptions to our kids for writing in that sense. Because the kid wrote a really interesting thing, and it was literally, you know how she wrote it? She said, your job, a day in a life of your job, what you'll do in the morning, what you might do at lunch, and why you'll know if you've been successful at the end of the day. Cool. Highly agile, but it required them to flip. It required them to change a little bit. Because particular in this situation, and I would argue now increasingly, we're going to have jobs and roles, and part of the process is they're going to define themselves or evolve themselves or stretch themselves into what that job is, which is going to be real interesting. What are the evaluation specs for it? What are the limits of it? How do you know that you're competent? When does it? Now, their daughter put something really interesting that HR couldn't handle. It said, nobody should do this job for more than 9 months. And her mom said, why? He said, well, after 9 months, you won't be good at it anymore because you've done it too much. She said, what do you mean? She said, well, don't you have like a point of saturation for all your jobs? She said, you know, like milk has an expiration label on it. Do your job descriptions have an expiration? Maybe out of the brains of our youngest come. But we're going to look at agility. How do we create agility in a variety of ways? So now we get to the one slide, okay? And I'll give you a copy of it. You can circulate it around. But I am really interested in flipping things. Now let me just share what flipping is, and then we're going to break into some really quick little conversations. I got turned on to the phrase flip by a good friend of mine. You might have read some of his books, Dan Pink. He wrote A Whole New Mind and Drive, and I'll talk a little bit about Dan later. Dan got turned on to Drive. This is kind of the way an idea gets circulated very rapidly, by a high school teacher from Colorado in the United States who became very well known for doing a viral PowerPoint called Shift Happens. Maybe you've seen it. There, I think, have been 14 million downloads of Shift Happens. Well, one of the shifts that happened was they lost their budget for his job in Colorado, so he had to go back to the classroom. He was an instructional technologist. He had to go back to the classroom, which he didn't mind. He's glad to be teaching. He teaches algebra to kids who are 3 years from graduating, probably 15 or 16. He's teaching now for the first time in 4 or 5 years, and he's looking out at the kids, and he says, he's quite honest. He said, I'm a pretty good teacher. I'm funny, I'm concise, and he's looking out at the kids, and they don't seem overly engaged. And then he's giving them homework to do, which is interesting homework, and they're coming back, and they have questions, but he can't really spend a lot of time on the questions because he has to give the lectures that he's got there. So he's sitting there and he goes, what if I flip it? What if I flip it? So what he did was he went out and he got a $116 camera. Okay, so I know that's a really big one back there, but this one has almost the same resolution. Okay, so change happens. He got a $116 camera, and he set it up on top of a soda bottle with a little tripod thing on it. And he ended up videotaping 6 days of lectures. 6 days of him basically talking about algebra. And here's the flip he did. he gave the kids the homework assignment of watching the video at home, and then